The sun hung low over Tombstone, Arizona, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. The year was 1886, and the silver mines still echoed with the dreams of desperate men. But for the lone rider making his way down the dusty trail toward town, dreams were a luxury he'd long abandoned. Jack Loner McCready pulled his weathered hat lower over his eyes, the leather reins loose in his calloused hands. His horse, a sturdy bay named Thunder, knew the way by heart. They'd ridden this path countless times, always moving, never staying. At 43, Jack had perfected the art of being invisible, of existing in the spaces between other people's lives. Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much. And continue with your story now. The wind carried the scent of sage and something else. Fear. Thunder's ears pricked forward, sensing what Jack's weathered instincts had already detected. Something was wrong. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, his voice gravelly from days of silence. That's when he heard it, a sound that cut through the desert stillness like a knife through canvas. "Help me! Please, somebody help me!" The voice was young, desperate, and coming from beneath the old wooden bridge that spanned Willow Creek. Jack's first instinct was to keep riding. He'd learned long ago that other people's troubles had a way of becoming your own, and he'd had enough trouble for several lifetimes. But the voice came again, smaller now, breaking with exhaustion. "My mother, she's going to die." Thunder snorted and shifted beneath him, as if the horse understood the weight of the moment. Jack closed his eyes, feeling the familiar war between self-preservation and something deeper, something he'd thought he'd buried years ago in a shallow grave outside Dodge City. "Damn," he whispered, and turned Thunder toward the bridge. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, huddled in the shadow of the wooden supports like a wounded animal. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with dirt and tears. In his small hands he clutched a crumpled piece of paper and what looked like a locket. "Please, mister," the boy said, scrambling to his feet as Jack dismounted. "You gotta help me. They took her. They took my ma, and they said they'd kill her if I told anyone, but I don't know what else to do." Jack studied the boy's face, noting the genuine terror in his green eyes. This wasn't some street urchin looking for a handout. This was a child in real trouble. "What's your name, son?" "Timothy. Timothy Walsh. But everyone calls me Timmy." The boy wiped his nose with his sleeve. "My ma, she's Sarah Walsh. She works at the boarding house in town, but 3 days ago these men came and—" "Slow down," Jack said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. He knelt to the boy's level, noting the way Timmy flinched at sudden movements. "Tell me what happened. From the beginning." Timmy's story came out in broken pieces, like fragments of a shattered mirror. 3 men had come to the boarding house where his mother worked as a cook. They'd claimed she owed them money, a debt from Timmy's father, who died in a mining accident 2 years prior. When Sarah protested that she'd never heard of such a debt, they'd taken her. "They left this," Timmy said, holding out the crumpled paper with shaking hands. Jack unfolded it carefully. The writing was crude but clear. "The woman stays with us until the debt is paid. $500 or she dies. Tell no one or she dies. You have 1 week. "Who were these men?" Jack asked, though something in his gut already knew this wasn't about money. "I don't know their names, but one of them, he had a scar right here." Timmy traced a line down his left cheek. "And he wore a silver star on his vest. But it wasn't like Sheriff Morrison's star. It was different." A chill ran down Jack's spine. A silver star that wasn't a sheriff's badge could mean only one thing in these parts: a federal marshal. But what would federal marshals want with a boarding house cook? "Timmy, did your mother ever mention anything about your father's work in the mines? Anything unusual?" The boy's eyes darted away, and Jack knew he was holding something back. She made me promise never to tell anyone. Said it would put us in danger." "Son, I think that danger's already found you." Timmy looked up at Jack with eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. Slowly, he opened the locket in his other hand. Inside was a small folded piece of paper and a tiny silver key. Pa gave this to Ma before he died. He said if anything ever happened to him, she should take this to someone named Marcus Whitmore in Tucson. But Ma was too scared. She said we should just forget about it and live quiet. Jack's blood ran cold. Marcus Whitmore was a name he knew, a federal judge who'd been investigating corruption in the territorial government. If Timmy's father had information valuable enough to interest Whitmore, then Sarah Walsh wasn't just a random victim. She was a target. "Timmy, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Jack said, standing and scanning the horizon. The sun was almost gone now, and shadows were growing long. "Those men who took your mother, they're not going to let her go, no matter what you do. They want what your father left behind. But I don't understand. Pa was just a miner. What could he have known?" Before Jack could answer, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the desert. 3 riders, moving fast and heading straight for the bridge. "Get behind Thunder," Jack ordered, his hand moving instinctively to the Colt 45 at his hip. "Stay quiet, no matter what happens." The riders pulled up in a cloud of dust. The leader was a tall man with a federal marshal's badge and a scar running down his left cheek, exactly as Timmy had described. His companions flanked him, hands resting on their weapons. Well, the scarred man said, his voice smooth as snake oil. "Jack McCready. Heard you were dead." "Marshal Pike," Jack replied, recognizing the man now. Ezra Pike, a federal marshal with a reputation for bending the law to his own purposes. "Funny thing about rumors." "Indeed. You wouldn't happen to have seen a young boy around here, would you? About 12 years old, answers to Timothy?" Jack kept his expression neutral, though his mind was racing. How did Pike know Timmy's name? How did he know to look here? "Can't say I have. This is a big desert, Marshal. Lots of places for a boy to hide." Pike's smile was cold as winter wind. "That's true. But you see, this particular boy has something that belongs to the federal government. Something his father stole before his unfortunate accident." The pieces were falling into place now, and Jack didn't like the picture they were forming. Timmy's father hadn't died in a mining accident. He'd been murdered, and now they were after his family to recover whatever he'd taken. "Like I said, haven't seen any boys. But if I do, I'll be sure to let Sheriff Morrison know." "Oh, I don't think that will be necessary," Pike said, his hand moving to his gun. "You see, Sheriff Morrison had his own unfortunate accident yesterday. Seems he fell down some stairs, broke his neck." Jack's jaw tightened. Morrison had been a good man, an honest lawman in a territory where such men were rare. If Pike had killed him, then this conspiracy went deeper than he'd imagined. "That's a shame," Jack said carefully. "He was a good sheriff." "He was a nosy sheriff," Pike corrected. "Just like that boy's father was a nosy miner. Funny how curiosity can be so fatal." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gunfight. Jack knew he was walking a tightrope now, with Timmy's life and his own hanging in the balance. "Well, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure, but I need to be getting to town before full dark." "Of course," Pike said, though he made no move to leave. "Just remember, McCready, some secrets are worth killing for, and some people are worth killing to keep those secrets buried." As the 3 riders disappeared into the gathering darkness, Jack helped Timmy out from behind Thunder. The boy was shaking, but his eyes held a new determination. "They killed my pa, didn't they?" Timmy whispered. Jack nodded grimly. "I believe they did, son. And they'll kill your mother too, unless we stop them." "What do we do?" Jack looked toward Tombstone, where the lights were beginning to flicker on like fallen stars. Somewhere in that town, Sarah Walsh was being held prisoner by men who'd already committed murder to protect their secrets. And somewhere else, the truth that had gotten her husband killed was waiting to be uncovered. "First, we're going to find your mother," Jack said, swinging up into Thunder's saddle and pulling Timmy up behind him. "Then we're going to make sure those men pay for what they've done." As they rode toward town, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was riding toward his own reckoning. He'd spent years running from his past, from the responsibilities and connections that had once defined him. But sometimes, a man couldn't run forever. Sometimes he had to make a stand. Behind him, Timmy clutched the locket that held his father's final secret. Ahead of them, Tombstone waited in the darkness, full of dangers they couldn't yet imagine. The hunt for Sarah Walsh was about to begin. The streets of Tombstone were quieter than usual as Jack and Timmy rode into town under the cover of darkness. The famous mining settlement, once bustling with fortune-seekers and outlaws, now felt subdued, as if the very air carried whispers of danger. Jack guided Thunder to the back of Murphy's livery stable, where old Pete Murphy was known for his discretion and his willingness to ask no questions for the right price. "Pete!" Jack called softly as they dismounted. A grizzled man emerged from the shadows, lantern in hand. Pete Murphy had been in Tombstone since the Silver Strike began, and his weathered face had seen enough secrets to fill Boot Hill Cemetery. "Jack McCready," Pete said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Heard you might be coming through. Also heard you might be bringing trouble. When don't I bring trouble, Pete?" "Fair point." Pete's eyes shifted to Timmy, who stayed close to Jack's side. "This the Walsh boy?" Jack's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. "How do you know about him?" "Because his ma's been asking about you for 3 days. Before they took her, she came here looking for you specifically. Said if anything happened to her, I should tell you to find the boy and get him to Tucson." The revelation hit Jack like a physical blow. Sarah Walsh had known him, but how? "Pete, I've never met Sarah Walsh in my life." "Maybe not," Pete said, leading Thunder into a stall. "But she sure knew you. Had a photograph and everything, old one from your cavalry days." Jack's blood ran cold. His cavalry days were a lifetime ago, buried along with too many good men and too many bad memories. Only a handful of people had photographs from that time, and most of them were dead. "What did she tell you exactly?" Pete glanced around nervously before answering. "She said her husband had given her your name before he died. Said if the federal marshals ever came for her, you were the only man who could be trusted to protect their boy." "Federal marshals?" Timmy whispered. "Just like the man with the scar?" "That'd be Ezra Pike," Pete confirmed. "He's been in town for a week, asking questions about the Walsh family. But he's not alone. There's 2 others with him, a man named Garrett and another called Stone. They've taken over the old Clanton Ranch outside town." Jack knew the Clanton Ranch. It had been abandoned since the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral 5 years earlier. Remote, defensible, and far enough from town that screams wouldn't carry. "Pete, what exactly did Thomas Walsh do in the mines?" The old man's expression grew even more troubled. "He wasn't just a miner, Jack. He was a surveyor. Worked for the territorial government, mapping the silver veins and recording claims. But about a month before he died, he came to me scared out of his wits." "Scared of what?" "Said he'd found something in the mines that wasn't silver. Something that certain people would kill to keep secret." Timmy pulled the locket from his pocket, holding it up to the lantern light. "He left this for Ma. There's a key inside, and a piece of paper." Pete examined the key carefully. "That's a safety deposit box key. Bank of Arizona, if I'm not mistaken. Thomas must have hidden whatever he found in the bank vault." Jack's mind was racing. If Thomas Walsh had discovered evidence of corruption, maybe illegal mining operations, claim jumping, or federal officials taking bribes, it would explain why Pike and his men were so desperate to recover it. "There's something else," Pete continued. "Sheriff Morrison came by yesterday morning just before he died. Said he'd been investigating some irregularities in the territorial mining reports. He thought Thomas Walsh might have been killed for what he knew. And now Morrison's dead too," Jack said grimly. "Convenient accident," Pete agreed. "Just like Thomas Walsh's mining accident." A sound from the street made them all freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, were approaching the livery stable. Pete quickly extinguished his lantern, plunging them into darkness. Through a crack in the wooden wall, Jack could see 2 figures moving down the street. One was tall and lean, Garrett, if Pete was right. The other was shorter but broader, with the build of a man who solved problems with his fists. "They're checking every building," Jack whispered. "Looking for the boy." "There's a root cellar under the feed room," Pete said quietly. "Hidden entrance behind the grain barrels. You can get to it without being seen." Jack helped Timmy toward the back of the stable, but the boy suddenly stopped. "Wait," Timmy whispered urgently. "I just remembered something. Before they took Ma, she said something strange. She said to tell you that the eagle remembers." The words hit Jack like a thunderbolt. "The eagle remembers" had been a code phrase from his cavalry unit during the Apache Wars. It meant that someone from his past was trying to make contact, that old loyalties and old debts were being called in. "Timmy, did your mother ever mention a man named Captain William Hayes?" The boy's eyes widened. "That was my pa's real name, William Hayes, but he changed it to Thomas Walsh when we came to Tombstone." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place. William Hayes, Jack's former captain in the 7th Cavalry, a man Jack had served with, fought beside, and trusted with his life, a man who had supposedly died in an Apache raid 3 years ago. But William Hayes hadn't died. He'd faked his death and taken a new identity, probably because he'd discovered something that made him a target. And now, even in death, he was reaching out to his old sergeant for help. The footsteps outside were getting closer. Jack could hear voices now, Garrett and Stone, discussing their search pattern. "Pete, is there another way out of here?" "Back door leads to the alley behind the barber shop. From there, you can get to the church without being seen." "The church?" "Father Miguel. He's been asking questions about the Walsh family, too. Might be he knows something that could help." Jack made his decision. "Timmy, we're going to see the priest. But first, I need you to understand something. Your father wasn't just Thomas Walsh, the miner. He was Captain William Hayes, one of the bravest men I ever served with. And if he left you that key, it's because he trusted you to finish what he started." Timmy straightened his shoulders, and for a moment, Jack could see the ghost of his old captain in the boy's determined expression. "What do we need to do?" "We need to get to that safety deposit box and find out what your father discovered. But first, we need to rescue your mother." They slipped out the back door just as Garrett and Stone entered the front of the livery stable. The alley was dark and narrow, filled with shadows that could hide a dozen men. Jack kept his hand on his gun as they made their way toward the church. St. Paul's Catholic Church sat on a small hill overlooking Tombstone, its wooden bell tower silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Father Miguel Hernandez had been the town's priest for over a decade, ministering to miners, gamblers, and outlaws with equal compassion. They found him in the vestry, reading by candlelight. He was a small man with gentle eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a life spent in service to others. "Father," Jack said quietly. The priest looked up, unsurprised by their presence. "Signor Macready and young Timothy, I have been expecting you." "You have?" "See. Your mother came to me 3 days ago before they took her. She made her confession and asked me to give you this if anything happened to her." Father Miguel handed Timmy a small wooden cross. Hidden inside the hollow interior was another piece of paper, this one with a hand-drawn map. "She said your father had shown her a secret place in the mines, a place where he hid something very important." Jack studied the map by candlelight. It showed a section of the Tough Nut mine, with an X marking a location deep in the abandoned tunnels. "Father, what did Sarah Walsh confess to you?" The priest's expression grew troubled. "I cannot break the seal of confession, but I can tell you this. She was very afraid, not for herself, but for her son. She said powerful men would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried." "Do you know where they're holding her?" "The Clanton Ranch. But, Senor Macready, it is heavily guarded. 3 men with rifles, and they have threatened to kill anyone who approaches." Jack folded the map and tucked it into his vest pocket. "Father, I need you to keep Timmy safe while I—" "No," Timmy interrupted. "I'm coming with you. She's my ma, and it's my pa's secret they're after. I have a right to be there." Jack looked into the boy's eyes and saw the same stubborn courage that had made Captain Hayes such an effective leader. There would be no talking him out of this. "All right, son, but we do this my way. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We get your mother out alive, and then we deal with whatever your father left behind." Father Miguel blessed them both, making the sign of the cross over their heads. "Vaya con Dios, my friends. And remember, sometimes the greatest courage is knowing when to ask for help." As they prepared to leave the church, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Pike and his men had been one step ahead of them all night, almost as if they knew exactly what Jack and Timmy were planning. But there was no choice now. Sarah Walsh was running out of time, and the secrets that had gotten her husband killed were still buried in the darkness, waiting to claim more victims. The rescue mission was about to begin, and Jack McCready was about to discover that some debts from the past could never truly be repaid. The abandoned Clanton Ranch sat like a scar on the desert landscape, its weathered buildings silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Jack and Timmy crouched behind a cluster of mesquite bushes about 200 yards from the main house, studying the layout through Jack's field glasses. 3 guards, just like Father Miguel said, Jack whispered. One on the front porch, one by the barn, and one walking patrol around the perimeter. Timmy peered through the darkness, his young eyes straining to see his mother. Where do you think they're keeping her? Most likely the main house. It's the most secure building, and Pike would want to keep her close. Jack lowered the glasses and turned to the boy. Timmy, I need you to promise me something. No matter what happens out there, you stay hidden until I give you the all-clear signal. What's the signal? 3 short whistles like a meadowlark. You hear anything else, you run back to town and find Father Miguel. Timmy nodded solemnly, clutching his father's locket. Mr. McCready, what if we're too late? Jack placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. Your mother is strong, son. She's survived 3 days with these men, which tells me she's tougher than they expected. We're going to get her out. Jack had been studying the ranch for over an hour, noting the guards' patterns and looking for weaknesses. The patrol guard was the key. He made a circuit every 15 minutes, and there was a blind spot behind the old bunkhouse where Jack could intercept him. Remember 3 whistles, Jack said, checking his Colt one final time. Stay here and stay quiet. Moving like a ghost across the desert floor, Jack used every shadow and depression in the ground to mask his approach. Years of cavalry training and too many dangerous situations had honed his skills to a razor's edge. The patrol guard was young and nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder as he walked his route. When he passed behind the bunkhouse, Jack was waiting. The confrontation was brief and silent. The guard went down without a sound, and Jack quickly bound and gagged him with strips torn from the man's own shirt. 1 down, 2 to go. The guard by the barn was the next target. Jack could see him clearly now. A heavy-set man with a rifle across his knees, sitting on a wooden crate and fighting to stay awake. The man's head kept nodding forward, then jerking back up as he caught himself dozing. Jack circled wide, approaching the barn from the back. The old building creaked and groaned in the desert wind, providing perfect cover for any small sounds he might make. When he reached the corner of the barn, he could hear the guards' heavy breathing just around the edge. A handful of sand and pebbles thrown to the far side of the barn drew the guards' attention. As the man stood and moved to investigate, Jack struck. Another guard down, another rifle secured. That left only the man on the front porch, and whatever was waiting inside the house. Jack crept to the side of the main building, pressing his ear against the weathered wood. Voices drifted through the thin walls, Pike's smooth tones, and another man's rougher voice, probably Stone. Should have found the boy by now, Stone was saying. He can't have gotten far. He's got help, Pike replied. McCready's in town. I saw him talking to the old man at the livery stable. So what do we do about the woman? She's not talking and we're running out of time. We stick to the plan. When we find the boy, we'll have everything we need. The woman becomes expendable at that point. Jack's jaw tightened. They were planning to kill Sarah Walsh as soon as they got their hands on Timmy. That changed everything. Moving to the back of the house, Jack found a window that had been left slightly open to let in the cool night air. Through the gap, he could see into what had once been the ranch's main room. Sarah Walsh sat tied to a chair in the center of the room, her head held high despite the obvious exhaustion and fear in her eyes. She was a handsome woman in her 30s, with dark hair and the kind of quiet strength that had attracted Captain Hayes all those years ago. Even bound and threatened, she maintained a dignity that spoke of inner steel. Pike and Stone stood near the fireplace, their backs to the window. The third man, Garrett, was nowhere to be seen, probably searching the outbuildings for any sign of Timmy. Jack studied the room's layout, noting the positions of furniture and the location of weapons. Pike wore his sidearm, and Stone had a rifle leaning against the mantelpiece. The front door was heavy wood with iron hinges. It would take time to break through if he needed an escape route. The window was his best option for entry, but it would mean leaving Sarah exposed for several crucial seconds while he dealt with the two men. Unless... Jack remembered the old cavalry trick Captain Hayes had taught him during the Apache campaigns. Create a diversion, divide your enemies, and strike when they're off balance. Moving to the front of the house, Jack found the guard on the porch exactly where he expected. A thin man with nervous eyes and twitchy fingers on his rifle. The man was facing outward, watching the desert for any sign of approach. Jack picked up a rock and threw it hard against the barn wall. The sharp crack echoed across the ranch yard, and the porch guard immediately stood up, rifle ready. "Stone!" the guard called out. "Something's moving by the barn!" Jack heard footsteps inside the house as Stone moved toward the front door. "Perfect. Go check it out," Pike's voice commanded. "And take Garrett with you. Garrett's not back yet from checking the mine shaft. Then go alone, and be careful." Stone emerged from the house, rifle in hand, and joined the porch guard. Together they moved cautiously toward the barn, leaving Pike alone with Sarah. This was Jack's chance. He slipped through the back window like smoke, landing silently on the wooden floor. Pike was standing with his back turned, looking out the front window at his men. "Don't move," Jack said quietly, his Colt pressed against Pike's spine. Pike stiffened but didn't turn around. "Jack McCready, I wondered when you'd show up. Hands where I can see them." Slowly. Pike raised his hands, but his voice remained calm and confident. "You're making a mistake, McCready. You don't understand what you're dealing with here. I understand enough. You killed Sheriff Morrison, you killed Captain Hayes, and you're planning to kill his wife and son." "Captain Hayes?" Pike chuckled. "Is that what you think this is about? Your old cavalry buddy?" Jack moved around to face Pike, while keeping the gun trained on him. "What else would it be about?" "Tell him, Mrs. Walsh," Pike said, his eyes shifting to Sarah. "Tell him what your husband really found in those mines." Sarah Walsh looked at Jack with eyes full of pain and secrets. "He found gold, Mr. McCready, not silver. Gold. Enough gold to make Arizona Territory the richest state in the Union." "And?" Jack prompted, sensing there was more. "And the federal government has been covering it up for 2 years," Pike continued. "Keeping the gold claims off the official records, mining it in secret, and shipping it east to fund certain unofficial operations." The implications hit Jack like a physical blow. A secret federal gold mine would be worth millions, enough to fund private armies, buy politicians, or finance covert operations that Congress would never approve. "William discovered the operation by accident," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He tried to report it through proper channels, but the corruption went too high. So he gathered evidence and planned to take it to Judge Whitmore in Tucson. But he never made it," Pike said. "We made sure of that." Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. "You murdered him." "We eliminated a threat to national security," Pike corrected. "Just like we're going to eliminate his family. Not if I have anything to say about it." Pike's smile was cold as winter. "But you don't, McCready. You see, while you've been playing hero, my men have been busy. Garrett isn't checking mine shafts. He's collecting your young friend." Jack's blood ran cold. "Timmy. By now, Garrett has the boy and is on his way back here. So you have a choice. Surrender now, and the boy lives long enough to watch his mother die. Or keep playing games, and they both die slowly." Through the front window, Jack could see a rider approaching in the distance. Even in the darkness, he could make out 2 figures on the horse, Garrett and a smaller form that had to be Timmy. Jack had walked into exactly the trap he'd feared. In trying to save Sarah Walsh, he'd delivered her son directly into Pike's hands. But Captain Hayes hadn't raised his son to give up without a fight, and Jack McCready hadn't survived this long by accepting defeat. "You're right about one thing, Pike," Jack said, his voice deadly calm. "This is about national security, but not the way you think." "What do you mean?" Jack smiled grimly. "I mean that locket the boy carries. It doesn't just contain a key to a safety deposit box. It contains a complete record of every federal official involved in your little gold operation, including their real names, their bank accounts, and their signatures on falsified documents. Pike's confident expression faltered slightly. You're bluffing. Captain Hayes was thorough, Pike. He knew he was a dead man, so he made sure his evidence would survive him. That locket contains enough information to bring down half the territorial government and probably a few federal judges, too. If that's true, it doesn't matter. We have the boy, we'll have the locket, and you'll all be dead before sunrise. Jack heard the sound of approaching horses getting closer. Garrett would be here in minutes, and then Jack would be outnumbered 3-1 with 2 civilians to protect. But he still had one card to play, one that Pike didn't know about. There's just one problem with your plan, Jack said, which is, the boy you think you captured? That's not Timmy Walsh. Pike's eyes widened in confusion just as 3 short whistles echoed across the desert night. The meadowlark call that Jack had taught Timmy. The real Timothy Walsh was still free, still had his father's locket, and was about to turn the tables on the men who had destroyed his family. The final confrontation was about to begin. The whistles echoed across the desert like a battle cry, and Jack saw Pike's confident expression crumble into confusion and rage. Through the front window, Garrett was dismounting from his horse, roughly pulling down a figure that Pike had assumed was Timmy Walsh. But Jack knew better. The boy Garrett had captured was actually Miguel Santos, Father Miguel's 12-year-old nephew, who had volunteered to act as a decoy when Jack explained the desperate situation to the priest. "You son of a—" Pike started, reaching for his gun. Jack was faster. His Colt barked once, and Pike's weapon went flying across the room. The corrupt marshal clutched his wounded hand, blood seeping between his fingers. "Sarah, are you hurt?" Jack asked, keeping his gun trained on Pike while moving to untie her. "I'm all right," she said, though her voice shook with exhaustion and relief. "But Jack, there's something else. Something I haven't told you about what William found. It'll have to wait," Jack said, hearing Garrett's heavy footsteps on the front porch. "We need to get out of here." But before they could move, the front door burst open. Garrett stood silhouetted in the doorway, his rifle aimed directly at Jack's chest. "Drop the gun, McCready," Garrett snarled, "or I'll put a hole in you big enough to drive a wagon through." Jack hesitated, weighing his options. Garrett was too far away to reach, and any sudden movement would likely get Sarah killed in the crossfire. "Do it," Pike ordered, wrapping his wounded hand with a torn piece of cloth. "And you, boy," he called to Miguel Santos, who was being pushed through the door. "Where's the real Timothy Walsh?" Miguel, brave beyond his years, simply stared back defiantly. "I don't know what you're talking about, senor." Pike backhanded the boy across the face, sending him sprawling. "Don't play games with me, you little—" "Leave him alone," Sarah cried out. "I'll leave him alone when I get what I came for," Pike snapped. "The Walsh boy, the locket, and the evidence his father stole." That's when the real Timmy Walsh stepped through the doorway, his father's locket held high in his small hand. "You want this?" Timmy said, his young voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Then let my mother and the others go." "Timmy, no!" Sarah gasped. But the boy had made his decision. "I heard what you said about my pa, about how you killed him and Sheriff Morrison. Well, I've got something to say about that." Pike's eyes gleamed with triumph. "Give me the locket, boy, and I might let your mother live long enough to see the sunrise." "I'll give it to you," Timmy said. "But first, you're going to hear the truth about what my pa really found in those mines." Jack watched the boy with growing admiration. Timmy was stalling, buying time just like his father would have done. But time for what? "Your father found gold," Pike said impatiently. "We know that already." "No," Timmy said, shaking his head. "He found something much more valuable than gold." He opened the locket and pulled out the small piece of paper inside. "This isn't a map to hidden treasure. It's a list of names. Federal marshals, territorial judges, mining officials, and bank presidents. All of them taking bribes to keep the real gold discovery secret." Pike's face went pale. "Give me that paper." "But that's not the best part," Timmy continued, his confidence growing. "The best part is that my pa made copies. Lots of copies. And he gave them to people all over the territory. You're lying. Am I? Timmy smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like his father. Tell me, Marshal Pike, have you checked your bank account lately? Pike's expression shifted from anger to confusion. What are you talking about? While you've been chasing us around Tombstone, Judge Whitmore in Tucson has been very busy. He's been freezing bank accounts, issuing arrest warrants, and sending federal investigators to examine mining claims all over Arizona territory. Jack felt a surge of hope. If Timmy was telling the truth, then Captain Hayes had planned even more carefully than anyone had imagined. Father Miguel sent a telegram to Tucson 3 hours ago, Timmy continued. He told Judge Whitmore everything, about my pa's murder, about Sheriff Morrison, about you holding my ma prisoner. By now, there are federal agents on their way here. Pike's face was now ashen. That's impossible. Whitmore is one of us. He's been taking payments for 2 years. No, Sarah Walsh spoke up, her voice strong and clear. Judge Whitmore was William's contact in Tucson. He's been working undercover for the Department of Justice, investigating territorial corruption. William wasn't trying to expose the gold mine to steal it. He was helping to build a case against the people who were stealing from the federal government. The pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place for Jack. Captain Hayes hadn't faked his death to escape. He'd faked it to go undercover. He'd been working with federal investigators to expose a massive corruption scheme that reached from the mines of Arizona to the halls of power in Washington. So you see, Marshal Pike, Timmy said, you didn't kill a traitor. You killed a federal agent. Pike's hand moved toward his backup gun, but Jack was ready for him. The Colt spoke again, and Pike crumpled to the floor, clutching his shoulder. Garrett, seeing his leader fall, swung his rifle toward Timmy. But before he could fire, a new voice spoke from the doorway. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Everyone turned to see a tall man in a federal marshal's badge standing in the entrance. Behind him were 3 more men, all armed and ready. Marshal James Crawford, Department of Justice, the man announced. Ezra Pike, you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and theft of federal property. Garrett dropped his rifle and raised his hands. The 3rd member of Pike's gang, Stone, had apparently fled when he heard the gunshots. As the federal marshals took Pike and Garrett into custody, Jack helped Sarah to her feet. She was weak from her ordeal, but her eyes were bright with relief and pride as she looked at her son. Timmy, she said, pulling him into her arms. You were so brave. Your father would be so proud. Is it really over? The boy asked. Marshal Crawford nodded. The corruption investigation has been going on for months. Your father's evidence was the final piece we needed to make our case. Thanks to him, we've arrested over 30 officials in the last week. What about the gold mine? Jack asked. It will be returned to federal control and operated legally. The profits will go to the territorial treasury where they belong. Sarah Walsh looked at Jack with tears in her eyes. William told me that if anything ever happened to him, you were the only man he trusted to protect us. He was right. Jack felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a burden he'd carried since the day he'd left the cavalry and started running from his responsibilities. Your husband was a good man, Sarah, one of the best I ever knew. He left something for you, she said, reaching into her dress pocket. He made me promise to give it to you if we ever met. She handed him a small leather pouch. Inside was a silver cavalry pin, the insignia of their old unit, and a note written in Captain Hayes's familiar handwriting. Jack, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and my family needed your help. Thank you for not letting me down. The eagle remembers, and so do I. Your friend always, William. Jack closed his eyes, feeling the ghosts of old battles and lost comrades finally beginning to rest. What will you do now? He asked Sarah. Judge Whitmore has offered me a position in Tucson, helping to reorganize the territorial mining office. It's time for a fresh start. And you, Mr. McCready? Timmy asked. Will you come with us? Jack looked at the boy, brave, intelligent, and carrying his father's legacy with quiet dignity. Then he looked at Sarah, whose strength and courage had sustained her through the darkest of times. For years, he'd been running from connections, from responsibilities, from the possibility of caring about people who might be taken away from him. But standing in that old ranch house, surrounded by the aftermath of corruption and violence, he realized that some things were worth the risk. "I think I might," he said. "I think I just might." 3 months later, Jack McCready stood on the porch of a small house in Tucson, watching Timmy Walsh practice his reading with a book about the cavalry. Sarah was inside, preparing dinner and humming a tune that reminded Jack of better days. The corruption investigation had indeed brought down dozens of officials, and the secret gold mine was now operating under proper federal oversight. Judge Whitmore had been promoted to the Territorial Supreme Court, and the new mining regulations were being held up as a model for other territories. But more importantly, the Walsh family was safe, and Jack had found something he'd thought was lost forever, a place to belong. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jack McCready finally stopped running. He'd found his way home at last, guided by the courage of a boy, the strength of a woman, and the memory of a friend who had trusted him to do the right thing. The eagle remembered, and so did he. Some debts, Jack realized, could only be repaid by learning to live again. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.